Thank you, Brock, so much, and thank you all for being here. I'm honored to speak to you and provide context to your visit to this area and to the symposium. Maggie Liggs, my predecessor as a state historian at Winterthur, in her definitive book on the houses and gardens of the DuPont family, wrote, and I quote, "No American family has dominated the industrial and residential architecture longer than the DuPonts of Delaware." This, I trust, will soon be evident. Larry Letterman and Marta McDowell's recent DuPont Gardens of the Brandywine is the perfect companion to that book with its wonderful images. But beyond the houses and gardens, this area is unique for the unparalleled impact of one family. The DuPonts, of course, had the largest businesses in the area. They owned some of the banks, published newspapers, built many of the schools and the roads you will travel upon. In 1913, they even built this hotel we are in tonight. Yet it is their legacy and generosity I want to now address in the wide array of houses, gardens, and museums. Moving north from downtown Wilmington, Kennett Pike, now Route 52, creates a spine for the expanse of DuPont estates, houses, and gardens. It crosses into Chester County, many were on it today, and reaches P.S. DuPont's Longwood. He paid for its paving. The pike follows the red dotted line you see on the screen. In the yellow box is part of Winterthur, which at its height encompassed 2,500 acres. Let us step back for a moment to the year 1800. Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours set sail for this country on the American Eagle with his sons and family. DuPont, described as a philosopher, economist, and poet, was already a wealthy and accomplished man. He had been ennobled by Louis XVI in 1784. He helped negotiate treaties at the end of the Revolutionary War, and later he would do the same for the Louisiana Purchase. Their emigration was not a story of a struggling family seeking opportunities in a new land. Having been labeled traitors because of their support of the royal family, by the later 1790s, it was time to leave France. With furniture, a large library of books, and even a piano, they set sail. After a rather perilous voyage, they arrived in Newport, Rhode Island on New Year's Day in 1800. They moved down to New Jersey, but before long to Delaware. You will see in this area that so many of the names of houses, villages, and even the railroad stops are French and associated with the family. This house in Chavannes, France, had special meaning. Acquired by Pierre Samuel in 1774 to be his country seat, its design became an inspiration for family houses in Delaware, and DuPonts like Henry Algernon of Winterthur and P.S. of Longwood would visit it when in France. The lead figure in my story tonight is Eleuthère Irénée DuPont, known as Irénée. A polymath like his father, he created the gunpowder works, built a successful business, but with an Enlightenment spirit, studied nature and pursued scientific agriculture. He designed his own residence, Eleutherian Mills, above the powder works, and in the 18-teens purchased 400 acres of land for his Merino sheep farm. That land is still at the core of Winterthur today. His prize-winning ram, Don Pedro, you see in the lower right, was such a celebrity at the time. There were statues made of him and prints. And when Don Pedro died, Thomas Jefferson sent Irénée a sympathy note. Irénée and his wife Sophie, 7 children, grew up at Eleutherian Mills. Rembrandt Peale portrayed many of the family, including Victorine and Eleuthera, who hang at Winterthur today. Irénée's brother Victor features into the story as well. A diplomat and an entrepreneur, he turned his attention to several ventures in upstate New York, but without great success. Many of the cousin marriages in later generations were between descendants of Irénée and those of Victor. Relocating to the Brandywine, he lived at Louviere's, designed by his brother and located on the opposite bank from the powder works. Victor began a business producing woolen goods. I believed he used his brother's fine merino wool. As will become evident, the world of the DuPonts was very narrowly defined, and many of the families spoke French with each other into the 20th century. Ownership of not only the powder works, but much of the land and many family houses was communal, the partnership as it was known. Sadly, the powder works regularly suffered explosions, and this helped spread the financial risk. I suspect it also reflected Pierre Samuel's unrealized idea of creating somewhat of a utopian community, originally planned for Virginia, and he was going to call it Pontiana. In 2000, the family celebrated the 200th anniversary of their arrival in America. By this time, over 2,500 descendants of the early DuPonts had been identified. Navigating the family tree can be very challenging. So many Henrys, Pierres, Alfreds, Victors, Eleuthiers, Evelinas, and Victorines. This is Boss Henry, the son of Irénée. His nickname was inspired by his presidency of the Gunpowder Company from 1850 to 1889 and its major expansion under his leadership. He married Louisa Gerhard from a prominent Philadelphia family, and they had 8 children. On her left is her son, Henry Algernon DuPont. In 1890, a major explosion ripped through the gunpowder works, damaging Eleutherian mills and blowing out some windows as far away as Winterthur. Louisa, now a widow, decided this was the final straw, or blast, and moved with her daughter, Evelina, to one of the partnership houses on what is now Kennett Pike. Built in 1881, and at first the residence of her son, William, it was designed by her son-in-law, Theophilus P. Chandler, who became the first dean of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. Note in the parlor the Peel portraits of several of her sister-in-laws. Let's turn now to Winterthur. In 1834, Irénée DuPont died. His merino farm became part of his estate, and his daughter Evelina and her husband Antoine Bitterman decided to make it their country place. Antoine, a business partner of Irénée's, shared a keen interest in agriculture and in retirement wanted to create a model farm. Here are the Bittermans. They traveled to Paris in 1838 to see their son and commissioned plans for a 12-room house. A Parisian architect designed an elegant Italianate villa, yet you can see, as built in Delaware, it became a Greek Revival house. I assume more familiar to the local builders and more in fashion. It is still at the core of the Winterthur house today. And while in France, they journeyed to Antoine's ancestral home in Winterthur, Switzerland. Inspired by its beauty, Evelina suggested naming their new country place for it. In the 1860s, Antoine and Evelina died. Their son James had no interest in the Delaware property and asked his uncle Henry to sell it. With no takers, Henry decided to buy it as an investment. Henry had long hoped his son, Henry Algernon, I'll refer to him as H.A., who placed first in his graduating class at West Point and had a distinguished military career, would return to Delaware and join the family business. After his 1874 marriage to socially prominent New Yorker Pauline Foster, he at last agreed. This quintessentially stern and stubborn Victorian gentleman sat on the DuPont Company board, became president of a regional railroad, and farmed the Winterthur land. In 1906, he was elected senator from Delaware. After some updating of the Bitterman house, the family had moved into it in 1876. By 1884, the house no longer suited a wealthy family with 2 young children. He commissioned his brother-in-law, T.P. Chandler, to add a 4th story, remodel the interiors, and produce a more fashionable residence. That's Henry Francis and his sister Louise on the lawn. The parlor captures the style of the time and his increasing position. Ornate details, heavy fabrics, bric-a-brac on every surface. No wonder their son Henry Francis reacted against this Victorian fussiness in creating his later Winterthur interiors. With his father's death in 1889, H.A. inherited a fortune. To keep up with the Joneses, or in this case, the DuPonts, he undertook a major expansion of the residence in 1903. A Gilded Age mansion appropriately in the French Renaissance style, it grew by nearly 35 rooms, with new entertaining spaces, servants' areas, a billiard room, indoor squash court, and several drawing rooms. Sadly, his wife Pauline died before work even commenced. Not surprisingly, their son Henry Francis stepped in to oversee the construction and the furnishing. In the style of that time, he chose an eclectic group of pieces described as continental. This was the Red Room. Of course, by 1930, he had jumped completely into the world of American decorative arts, and this became the Marlborough Room. The bulk of Boss Henry's millions went to his sons H.A. and William. They looked after their sisters in turn. Across from Winterthur, H.A. helped Victorine build Verreau, Chandler, again the architect. Victorine's husband, in keeping with the very small world nature of this area, was the brother of Pauline DuPont. Described as a master of indecision, he was primarily a gentleman of leisure. The house no longer stands, but several outbuildings have survived. For his sister Evelina, H.A. built Lindum, a colonial revival house on Kennett Pike, designed by architect Robson Perrott, who did the 1903 expansion of Winterthur, and whose wife was a DuPont. In the photo of the carriage at the porte cochere, you will see her nephew, Henry Francis DuPont, as the whip. You may spy this house if you are stopped on Kennett Pike at the traffic light at Campbell Road. It's still a private residence. H.A.'s brother William oversaw several of the DuPont company operations, including one of the chemical works. After their father's death in 1889, H.A. sought William's support in his goal to become the next company president. William did not back him, and thus began an estrangement that lasted the rest of their lives. To add to the division, in 1892, William divorced his wife, it had been an arranged marriage, and remarried. H.A. became even more vindictive. Other family were also critical, so William and his new wife Annie decamped to England. They settled happily into the social and sporting life there. But in 1901, they returned, but this time to Virginia, purchasing James Madison's Montpelier. Here you see their two children, William Jr., known as Willie, and Marion, and that's where they would be raised. They expanded the house and added new gardens. Willie DuPont became a well-known sportsman, especially in equestrian pursuits and golf. He served on the board of the DuPont Company and was president of a family bank. After his marriage to Jean Austen in 1919, her father gave them a large farm in Pennsylvania, and his father built them a house. You will see that it is yet another Montpelier, an icon in this branch of the family. William Sr. also owned this rather dreary castle-like house built in 1855 in Wilmington. He rarely used it, and after his death in 1928, it passed to his son, Willie. In 1931 through to 33, Willie undertook a major remodeling, and as you can see, it morphed into another Montpelier. After his divorce from his wife Jean in 1940, it would be his primary Delaware residence. His sister Marion DuPont Scott inherited Montpelier. Today, as Bellevue State Park, the house and many of the outbuildings survive. William was particularly close to his sister Ellen. Although she and her husband, Alexander Dewar Irving, had a Wilmington residence, their noteworthy country house was Sunnyside in Tarrytown, New York, built for Irving's great uncle, Of course, author Washington Irving. But in typical DuPont fashion, they expanded it into a large country house, adding over 30 rooms. Of course, when it later became an historic house museum, those additions were shorn. Near to Williams, Montpelier in Virginia, the Irvings had an early 19th century house as the centerpiece of their horse farm. With Boss Henry's death in 1889, the presidency of DuPont passed to his cousin Eugene, much to H.A.'s disappointment. It's his son's house we're going to look at next. I have to admit, this may be my favorite DuPont house. The work of New York architect Harry Lindenberg, described as an architect for the Jazz Age, it captures the picturesque English inspiration and all the rich craftsmanship of the era. Here, Eugene Jr. tended his 500-acre farm. A major owner of DuPont stock, he retired in his 30s from business to pursue farming and sports. His nickname was Dirty Gene, not because of any bad habits, but because of his love of farming. And to avoid confusion with his cousin Eugene E. DuPont, he became known as Clean Gene. Owl's Nest became famous worldwide in 1937 when the DuPont's daughter married FDR Jr. This was a Hatfields and McCoy moment. Although FDR had been close to many of the family and was in Henry Francis and Ruth DuPont's wedding party in 1916, by the 30s there was no love lost. New Deal policies and high taxes ended any friendships. The possibly apocryphal story goes that at the reception for nearly 1,000 guests on a day with very heavy rain, FDR quipped, "I love nothing better than to see the rich get soaked." I admire how beautifully this house has been preserved since 1961, when it became the Greenville Country Club, and the careful restoration they undertook of the Ellen Biddle Shipman designed garden and tea house. Eugene DuPont and his cousin Henry Francis were close and shared a passion for their farms, but in many ways they were quite different, with HF distinguishing himself as a collector and a garden designer, while Eugene and so many of the family were characterized as the huntin', shootin', fishin' DuPonts. They rode to hounds with Vic Mead Hunt or spent time hunting game birds at their Chesapeake Bay or South Carolina retreats. In 1902, Eugene Sr. died. This time, no one stepped forward to seek the presidency of the DuPont Company. Talk was it would be sold to another firm. But 3 young cousins came forward and with support from family like H.A., bought the company and launched it into the 20th century. It really was a leveraged buyout. Evidently, the cousins only put up about $750 each, and the elders from the family then backed them with their stock. We will look first at Alfred I. You'll be visiting his memoirs. Trained as an engineer at MIT, he brought those skills to the new firm. Alfred first married a Bostonian named Bessie Gardner. In 1906, the family again took sides when he divorced Bessie, soon known by many as Poor Bessie. He married his cousin Alicia Bradford Maddox, felt by many as too grand. It was clear she was not fond of Wilmington, and to her its narrow world, much preferring Paris. Alfred spent freely creating major houses and building yachts for Alicia. Nemours is the most noteworthy of his houses, designed by Carrere and Hastings of New York, and unequaled by the DuPonts in formality of house furnishings and gardens. They also did his Long Island mansion, White Eagle. Alice was bereft when Alicia died in 1920. In 1921, he married someone quite different than Alicia, Jessie Ball, old Virginia family, not grand. By this time, his fortune was greatly diminished. He sold his DuPont stock in 1917, missing out on large growth, and he became a bit of a spendthrift. Many costly legal battles with his cousins reduced it further. Yet his fortune soon grew again under the shrewd guidance of his brother-in-law, Edward Ball. Now Florida was the source: timberland, real estate, citrus groves, and paper mills. While they continued to live at Nemours while in Wilmington, they mostly spent time in Florida, completing this house in Jacksonville in 1927. Jesse also began to mend family ties between Alfred and his children and his cousins. When we look at the DuPont fortunes today, we find Alfred's may have grown to become the largest, and his Nemours Foundation not only funds the preservation of the house and gardens, but more importantly, the Nemours Children Health Network. Next cousin. T. Coleman DuPont was also MIT trained, but he brought his business savvy to the new company as well. Like Alfred, his attention shifted away from the company, in his case to hotels, real estate, and roads. In 1915, he sold his DuPont stock to his cousin P.S. and others. With the proceeds, he began acquiring hotels, such as the original Waldorf Astoria in New York and the Willard in Washington, D.C. He also invested in development in Florida and built the DuPont Highway, which is Route 13 in Delaware, at his own expense. He and his wife, Elsie's Wilmington house was a relatively modest Tudor, especially compared to his cousins. Their favorite place was a country retreat they called the Old Mill, purchased in 1906. Centered on a converted mill, Elsie used it as a playhouse and created naturalistic gardens as accents. Coleman's Brookdale farm surrounded it. The year before his death in 1930, he gifted much of the land to the city of Wilmington, which needed a new reservoir. A new dam made that possible, but the old mill was lost as what became the Hoops Reservoir filled. On the higher ground above the old mill, Elsie continued her garden, assisted by landscape architect Robert Wheelwright. In 1943, some of that land became a park. And as a side note, President Biden's residence overlooks that reservoir today. The last of the cousins is the man often characterized as the creator of the modern corporate model. Another MIT-trained engineer and a brilliant businessman, he led the DuPont company in its major growth, and then along the way became president of General Motors and United States Rubber. This became the era at DuPont of better living through chemistry and the wide range of products including nylon, rayon, cellophane, and Duco paints. P.S. married his cousin Alice Beelan in 1915. But in 1906, he had already purchased a private arboretum known as Pierce's Park, just over the state line in Pennsylvania, mainly to save it. Over the years, it expanded to 926 acres with a working dairy farm. P.S. and Alice lived fairly simply in the Pierce house, enlarged with a new wing, but the opposite of his cousin Alfred's Nemours in scales and interior. Yet the gardens surpassed Nemours with the vast conservatories, range of greenhouses, fountain display, and amphitheater for performance of dance and music. At the height, over 325 people worked in the gardens and farm at Longwood. P.S., eldest of 10 children of Lamont and Mary Beelan DuPont, was thrust into the position of head of that family at age 14 when his father died in an explosion at the gunpowder works in 1884. For several years, they lived in a partnership house called Old Nemours, and then Mary commissioned a new residence. Named actually for a Beelan family-associated place in France, Saint-Amour, a large Queen Anne-style house sat along Kennet Pike. In 1900, it welcomed many of the DuPont family to celebrate the 100th anniversary of their arrival in America with an elaborate Gilded Age dinner widely reported in newspapers around the country. After Mary's death in 1913, her son Lamont inherited the house, adding a large garage complex, more greenhouses, and hiring landscape architect Marion Coffin to design new formal garden areas. The house is now gone, replaced by playing fields for the Tower Hill School, but the garage has been repurposed and features of that garden survive. Mary carved off parts of the land for other family members. It became known in the family as the neighborhood. Styles varied with Tudor, colonial, and arts and craft. In keeping with the family love of gardens, many featured notable ones with distinctive character. The water features, Palm House, and fernery at Felix and Mary DuPont's Elton were the setting for another Ropes and Perrott designed house. Well known in the time, they were a highlight of the Garden Club of America's visit to Wilmington in 1929. Rodney Sharp grew up further south in the state. A school teacher, then an accountant, he became a key assistant to P.S. DuPont, spending a lot of time, therefore, at Santa Moore. Here he met and then married P.S.'s sister, Isabella. The Sharps acquired a sizable stone house in 1909 along Kennett Pike. It dated from the 1840s. Restored and updated, it became their Wilmington residence. Sharp, like H.F. DuPont, loved building projects, was a collector, and had a keen eye for interior planning. After a young architect named Albert Ives designed their house in Boca Grande, Florida, in 1927, Sharp lured him north to Wilmington, and soon together they remade Gibraltar. The gardens are the work of Marion Coffin, begun in 1915. The house has languished over the years with fits and starts of restoration and possible reuse, but I believe once again it may be moving forward. The gardens fared better, restored and opened for visitors under the auspices of Preservation Delaware. Just north of Winterthur, Bella Sharp in 1930 laid out Meon Farm. Using Ives, again as an architect, his complex of rustic stone farm buildings and landmark tower adjoined her small retreat, a place to gather with friends, play cards, have tea. An avid horsewoman and fox hunter, she stabled her horses here. When I first saw the name Meon, I pondered another French name. They're all using French names. But according to family, more likely is Meon, my own place and retreat. Boca Grande, the winter colony on Gasparilla Island on the west coast of Florida, is famous for its Gulf of Mexico beaches, its sports fishing, and golf. And although people from Philadelphia, New York, and Boston might be found there, it is inextricably identified with the DuPonts. Louise and Frank Crowninshield were the first to go there around 1916. H.F. and Ruth followed in the early 20s, and soon other DuPonts. Most significantly for Boca Grande, even to this day, the Sharps. They commissioned Albert Ives to create their house, La Hacienda. Its interiors were a combination of the Moorish and the Spanish. And Marion Coffin laid out the gardens as well. Some in the family, like Ruth DuPont, nicknamed it the Winter Palace. The Sharp family still owns La Hacienda, and their holdings also include the Gasparilla Inn and Club. Some of you on Sunday will be treated to a day in historic Odessa. In 1938, Rodney Sharp began acquiring the 18th century houses there to preserve them, beginning with the William Corbett House, now known as the Corbett Sharp House. He added other later buildings, including the Brick Hotel. Over time, they were given to Winterthur and administered by them for many years until becoming a separate not-for-profit organization. The photo on the right dates from 1966. Here, H.F. DuPont holds center stage. To his left, antique dealer and advisor J. Lloyd Hyde. To his right, Edgar Richardson, Winterthur's director at the time, and behind them, Winterthur's first director, Charles Montgomery, and his wife, Florence, the curator of textiles. In 1919, Irénée DuPont, P.S.'s brother, succeeded him as president of DuPont. We see him pictured on the cover of Life magazine in 1956 with his son and grandson, the first Irénée by Peel looking down from over the mantle. Irénée married his cousin Irene. Notice how the genealogical charts keep getting more complicated. She was Irene DuPont. They had 9 children, 8 daughters, and 1 son. You see the married names of 7 of the daughters on the screen. Some may sound familiar to you. His son, Irenee, known as Brip, also MIT trained in 2023, died in 2023 at age 103. He was a generous supporter of Winterthur, Hagley, Longwood, and many of the local colleges, schools, and universities. For his large house set on 500-acre farm, Irenee asked his MIT classmate, Albert Spar, to plan this rambling fieldstone house sitting high on a plateau of land. It looked over towards Winterthur and to the Brandywine. It featured a large Aeolian pipe organ with a wide mural by Maxfield Parrish. Reportedly, many of the best parties were held here, including the coming out parties for their daughters. The gardens were laid out by Irene, supported by a skilled staff of gardeners. For many years, many of us wondered what would become the fate of Greenogue after Brip DuPont's death. Another happy ending. It is now Longwood at Greenogue, and they are working on a master plan for its future preservation and use. In 1900, H.A. and Pauline DuPont's daughter, Louise, married Boston Brahmin Frank Crowninshield, here seen in the photo of the wedding party at Winterthur. Note that one of her brother H.F.'s fox terriers has crashed the photo, most appropriate as Frank and Louise were always surrounded by a menagerie of dogs. Many of us in recent years have been writing and lecturing more about Louise as collector, historian, and preservationist. She funded restoration of houses up and down the East Coast. A founder of the National Trust, its top preservation award carries her name today. An avid gardener, she served on the board of Arnold Arboretum and the Garden Club of America. In 1922, Eleutherian Mills came up for sale. Badly damaged in the 1890 explosion, it eventually became a clubhouse for the DuPont Company workers after some repairs. Now the DuPont Company was moving on, and much of the old powder works was being sold. H.A. DuPont hated to see the old family homestead sold out of the family. With the understanding that Louise and Frank would spend several months of the year in Wilmington, he purchased it for them. They would move between Boston, summer in Marblehead, winter in Boca Grande, and spring on the Brandywine. Louise asked her brother H.F. to oversee the restoration of the house. He loved these projects. Philadelphia architects Meller and Meggs did the work. Louise planned the interiors. Her furnishing plan, she enjoyed doing those for historic sites, focused on pieces appropriate to the early 19th century when her great-grandparents lived there. Her brother and Winterthur have been so much the focus of attention, but look at how she used antiques and floral display. Note the dogs, too. So often, HF's move to collect American is ascribed to people like Electra Havemeyer Webb, but increasingly we believe also Louise was the key influence. She was collecting before her brother. The old-style kitchen used for informal dining room at Eleutherian Mills no doubt was influenced by her good friend Henry Davis Sleeper and his Beauport in Gloucester. Sleeper went on to be HF's decorator for his Southampton summer place, Chestertown House, and worked with him in the beginning on the expansion of Winterthur from 1929 to 31. We tend to think great DuPont gardens, of course, Longwood, Winterthur, Nemours, Mount Cuba. But many believe the most innovative was Eleutherian Mills. Frank Crowninshield, a noted watercolor artist, used a keen eye to plan the garden, a romantic ruin formed from collapsed buildings of the powder works and embellished with columns, classical statuary, and mosaics. Louise focused on the plants and ornamental display. The garden as seen in this painting captures its romance and beauty. After Louise's death in 1958, the property passed to the Eleutherian Mills Hagley Foundation, with the house becoming a museum. By 1962, the focus shifted to the history of the powder works. The ruined garden by now really was becoming a ruin. and it was in part because it was not easily accessible and by its very nature, difficult to maintain. There is hope that a recent master plan by Nelson Bird Woltz will lead to at least some restoration of this unique garden. You will be spending a day at Winterthur packed with great lectures, tours, and workshops. I will not speak much about it tonight, other than to remind you it blends the best of all these houses and gardens in a signature way. Here we have H.F. and Ruth in their Park Avenue apartment in 1922 with their daughters. Keep in mind, he was assembling a very significant collection already, paying high prices to furnish his New York place, but not American, 17th, 18th, and early 19th century English, French, Italian, and Spanish pieces. By 1929, with a large inheritance from his father, H.A., and a rapidly growing collection, now mainly American, he began what would be an addition of over 75 rooms, with the house now 9 stories tall at its highest point. Albert Ives served as his architect, but we know H.F. micromanaged all the details. When completed and they moved in April 1931, he had spent over $3 million, Depression years, on the house, the gardens by Marion Coffin, a pool, golf course, and tennis courts. This amount does not include the antiques. Not the best years for such a grand project, and he was out on a shaky financial limb for a while, but he always bounced back. Well, we might think that the Depression years put an end to the DuPont family era of building large houses and gardens. Actually, it was a time for new commissions and evolving style. Earlier, you saw this map. Look again at all the properties. They're mostly owned by DuPonts. The next generation was inheriting, and DuPont Company was still doing well. Around the Greenville and Centerville areas and adjacent to Winterthur, many new places appeared. A few examples. We start to lean far more to the colonial now. For Amy DuPont, the sister of Eugene DuPont of Owl's Nest, her house was sited on a nearby piece of land. Architect Mary Craig's interpretation of Mount Vernon was a departure for both the area and the architect. Craig practiced in Santa Barbara, mostly in Spanish colonial. In 1918, Amy DuPont started going to Montecito in the wintertime. Craig's house sat across from DuPont's, and they became friends, leading to this commission. This remains a private residence and recently was placed on the National Register. The best known of the architects working in the Pennsylvania farmhouse style was R. Brognard Oakey. Most of his work is on Philadelphia's main line or in Chester County, often 18th century houses expanded and updated. But Oakey became a favorite of the next generation of DuPonts and completed a number of houses in the area. This was one of the largest of his commissions for Henry Belin DuPont, a noted aviator. The house still belongs to the family. And on the subject of aviators, Richard C. DuPont and his sister Alice Mills were also enthusiasts. They grew up in the house Elton I showed you earlier. Here they are seen at Henry B's DuPont Airfield. Richard made aviation his business with All-American Aviation Company, and in 1939 won key airmail routes. Keeping with the family's enthusiasm for horses, Alice and her husband James bred top racehorses and steeplechasers. That passed down to the next generation and their daughter Phyllis. Saturday you visit the Brandywine Museum, where you will see works by her husband, Jamie Wyeth, and his father, Andrew. And this is Phyllis and Jamie with their horse, Union Rags, winning the Belmont Stakes. Another well-known horse breeder in the family was Jane DuPont Lunger, a great supporter of Winterthur. So many of its collection's cataloging projects were possible because of her generosity. I hope as you look at Oberod, which sits on Kennett Pike, right at the Pennsylvania state line, it rings a bell. Bois de Fossé must have provided some of the inspiration. Today it is privately owned and used as an event and conference center. You'll see its gatehouses as you head north along Kennett Pike towards Longwood. A stone house closer to Wilmington dates from the mid-18th century. Remodeled in 1868 for a DuPont, by the 1920s, it belonged to the daughter of Coleman DuPont, Ellen Meads. Expanded and updated once again, beginning in 1924, her attention soon turned to the gardens. She brought in Robert Wheelwright for the planning, and in 1937 they married. This is now preserved as the Good Stace Center of the University of Delaware. And Ellen Meads was the mother of Bruce Perkins, a name I'm sure familiar to all of you through the trust and chairman of Winterthur's board. Lamont DuPont Copeland, a nephew of P.S. DuPont, became DuPont Company president and saw it through another period of new product introduction. In 1935, the Copelands began their colonial revival house, designed by his cousins, Victorine DuPont Homsey and her husband, Samuel. Better known for their modernist works, they also excelled in traditional design. And I should note, you will see their mid-century modern work in the Pavilion Visitor Center at Winterthur tomorrow and the Copeland Lecture Hall. Pamela and Lamont Copeland were accomplished collectors of American decorative arts. I have no doubt some of you knew Mrs. Copeland. She looks towards us from the dining room table in this photo. Lamont, godchild of H.F. DuPont, served as Winterthur's board chairman for many years after it opened as a museum, and was also involved with Hagley. The living room featured salvaged historic architecture and important pieces. Much of her collection of Chinese export porcelain is at the Peabody Essex Museum. Other objects were sold at auction after her death in 2001, as she had specified. Mount Cuba transformed into a public garden and as a center for native plants and habitat. In addition to the naturalistic garden areas, there are more formal gardens designed by Philadelphia's Thomas Sears and by Marion Coffin around the swimming pool. Mount Cuba offers tours, environmental education, a wide array of programs and events, and the Mount Cuba Foundation is a major funder for the purchasing of land for open space, and in fact helped Longwood acquire Grenoble. In the 1950s and 60s, development began to speed up in the Brandywine Valley, concerning many people about the rapid change. At the forefront was George Weymouth, known as Frolic, the grandson of Clean Jean, and he began a campaign to put land into conservation easement. In 1967, the Brandywine Conservancy was founded and now holds easements on over 40,000 acres. Just down the road in Chadds Ford, Weymouth purchased for himself a mid-18th century house on a bend in the river, not in the best of conditions. A noted artist and a skilled designer, he later created a private chapel. Patterns also in the 1960s, Elise and Pete DuPont, he was governor of Delaware, commissioned a landmark of modern design, both house and garden. The house was designed by their friend Chicago architect Ike Coburn, the landscape by Dan Kiley, who was responsible for reimagining of modern landscape design for parks and houses. Note the homage to Eleutherian Mills Garden that was just across the Brandywine from Patterns. And because continuity is important, part of the DuPont House and Garden story, both the Big Bend and Patterns still belong to the family. Over the years, Wilmington has grown as a city. It's no longer a DuPont Company town, and in fact, the company has been purchased by others. The hotel is no longer owned by the company. Primary movers of the economy, in addition to DuPont-affiliated concerns, are credit card companies, legal firms, and manufacturers such as Gore. But as you head out of the city, and so much of the landscape remains the same, winding roads along the Brandywine, fields and rolling hills, architecturally significant houses, public and private gardens, so many associated with the DuPont family. Thank you.